Jack Delaney had seen too much war to believe in ghosts. But that night, as his K9 partner Ranger stood rigid before a crumbling wall deep inside a forgotten bunker, growling low with a kind of ancient certainty, Jack felt something colder than fear settle in his chest. Something was there, not a ghost, something real, something buried. Only 24 hours earlier, he'd laughed when the lawyer read the will. An underground bunker. Jack had repeated, stunned. That's what my grandfather left me. A concrete box. Technically, it's yours now, the attorney replied, adjusting his glasses. World War II era, northern Montana. Locals call it Ashford Hill. It sounded like the punchline to a cruel joke. Jack had just buried his wife 2 months earlier. Cancer. She fought like hell, insurance folded like paper. Every cent they had vanished into hospital bills, experimental drugs, flights to specialists. And now all he had left was Ranger, a German shepherd with a steel-stitched hind leg, a cloudy right eye, and instincts sharper than any machine Jack had seen in combat. Jack loaded the truck without thinking much. Ranger jumped into the back seat like it was a mission briefing. That was the thing about K9s. They didn't ask why. They followed. The road north twisted through pine-choked silence, the kind of landscape that muffled cell signals and made you forget the world kept turning. The last 5 miles weren't paved. A rutted dirt path led them into a patch of woods that hadn't seen traffic since Eisenhower was in office. When the bunker finally appeared, half sunken into the hillside, rebar clawing out like broken ribs, it looked exactly as worthless as advertised. Home, sweet hell, Jack muttered. The shack nearby was barely standing. Half the roof had caved. But the concrete mouth of the bunker itself stood firm, rusted steel door half choked by vines. Jack reached for the padlock snapped clean off, like someone had been here before. Ranger was already sniffing the edges, his posture alert but calm, always reading the ground, the wind, the silence. Jack trusted that dog more than he trusted himself. He stepped inside. The air was wet, metallic, like old blood. His boots echoed down a short corridor that led into a wide room with a sagging desk, overturned cots, and the skeletal remains of equipment that had outlived its purpose. The only sound was Ranger's claws clicking softly against the cracked floor. Jack dropped his pack and wiped his hands on his jeans. The space was big enough to camp. Barely. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. That night, he lit a single lantern and sat against the far wall with Ranger curled beside him. The dog hadn't relaxed, not fully. His ears stayed half up, nose twitching every few seconds. Jack took out the faded manila envelope the lawyer had handed him. Inside were 2 keys, one labeled storage, the other unmarked. And a letter, handwritten in a rough, angular script. Jack, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. What I left you isn't worth money. It's heavier than that. Keep your eyes open. Trust the dog. Samuel Delaney. Jack didn't remember much about his grandfather. The man had been quiet, strict, sharp-eyed, and always paranoid. Family law said he never trusted banks, the government, or doctors. Jack used to think it was just age talking. But now, in this tomb of concrete and moss, the warning felt different. Heavy. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Jack followed the dog's gaze. Nothing. Just a wall streaked with mold and years of leaking rain. Then Ranger stood. Muscles coiled, tail stiff, ears pricked forward. A low rumble rolled from his chest. Not a bark, not panic, just pure, calculated warning. Easy, Jack whispered, rising slowly. He reached for the flashlight and shone it on the wall. Nothing moved, but Ranger didn't budge. Jack walked closer, tapped the wall with his knuckles. It echoed slightly different from the others. He knelt, ran his hand along the seam where the concrete met the floor. A jagged edge, almost intentional. "You're onto something," he muttered. Ranger tilted his head, eyes never leaving the spot. Jack retrieved a rusted crowbar from the debris pile. The first hit sent dust exploding into the air. The second cracked through a thin veneer of plaster. Beneath it, metal. Not part of the original wall. Jack stepped back. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Ranger barked once short, sharp, a signal. He looked into the shadows behind him, suddenly unsure if they were alone. This wasn't a random hiding place. Someone had put effort into sealing this part off. Whoever they were, they hadn't wanted it found. And yet Jack's grandfather had left him a key, a clue, and Ranger had found the rest. Something was buried here. He ran his palm over the cold, damp metal and whispered the words before he even realized what they meant. "This isn't a bunker. It's a vault." Ranger pressed his body against Jack's leg and exhaled, like a soldier waiting for orders. Whatever lay behind that wall had been hidden for a reason, and someone, somewhere, might still want it that way. The morning after Ranger's growl at the wall, Jack woke to a thin beam of sunlight pushing through a crack in the bunker's frame. The light barely reached the far corners of the room, but it was enough to make the dust dance like ghosts. He'd slept in his boots, one hand on his sidearm, Ranger curled at his feet like a coiled spring. The dog stirred first, ears twitching before his eyes even opened. Jack watched him still, alert, sniffing the air. "You smell something?" Jack asked, rubbing his temples. Ranger stood and padded silently toward the corner near the bunker's back wall. The same wall from last night. Jack followed with a flashlight and a silent prayer that they hadn't stepped into something bigger than they could handle. That corner didn't look any different in daylight. Crumbling plaster, water stains, rust lines like spider webs. But when Jack tapped the concrete with a wrench, he felt it again, that faint, hollow sound. And Ranger wasn't just sniffing now, he was pacing, tense, focused, like a soldier walking point through enemy lines. Jack dropped to one knee and began peeling away loose chunks of plaster and debris. Behind the outer layer, the concrete looked newer, smoother. Someone had patched this section deliberately. He kept digging. After 20 minutes of work, his fingers scraped metal. He pried it loose. First one brick-sized panel, then another. Behind them, a narrow compartment had been carved into the wall, barely bigger than a shoebox. Jack reached in carefully. His fingers brushed something cold. He pulled out a metal container, square, battered, and sealed with a rusted latch. The top bore no markings, just age and grime. Ranger stood completely still now, nose twitching as Jack set the box down on an overturned crate. Jack hesitated, then popped the latch. It resisted, groaned, then gave. Inside was a brass compass, heavy, ornate, with intricate etchings on its rim. Next to it, a folded sheet of brittle paper with symbols and sequences that didn't make sense at first glance. Numbers, letters, arrows. And at the top, one name written in bold, deliberate script. C. Ashford. Jack sat back, the box resting in his lap. The name hit harder than he expected. C. Ashford. His grandfather used to mutter that name after a few drinks. The Ashford Code, he'd say. They buried the truth in numbers. Jack had always chalked it up to old man rambling, war stories and whiskey. But this wasn't rambling. This was real. He unfolded the sheet. It was fragile, yellowed, but preserved well enough to read. The cipher was complex, far beyond anything Jack remembered from his military briefings. But there was intention in it. Layered columns, mirrored digits, names scratched in the margins. Union payroll, burden ridge, tunnels marked red. Jack reached into the box again and found a smaller envelope tucked beneath the compass. Inside were 3 photographs, sepia-toned, faded. One showed a line of soldiers beside a bunker entrance, their faces blank, the background unmistakably this very forest. Another depicted Crate's military issue with stenciled numbers, and the last photo was chilling. It showed a man standing beside a vault door, hand resting on a heavy key. The door bore the insignia of the Army Corps of Engineers, dated 1865. On the back of the photo, in the same sharp script, Ashford's Last Stand. Jack stared at the image, heart pounding. This wasn't a joke. His grandfather had guarded something. Something buried here, something tied to the Civil War, and now it was in his hands. Ranger let out a short huff and turned sharply toward the far side of the room. "What now?" Jack whispered. The dog stalked toward a patch of floor covered in dust and pine needles blown in from the open door. He sniffed, growled, then pawed at the ground. His tail was stiff, his movements tight. Jack rose quickly, flashlight cutting across the bunker floor. There, barely visible, was a faint imprint in the dirt. A footprint. Not his. Boot tread, wide and deep. Fresh. Jack's blood chilled. He knelt beside it. The impression was sharp enough to show texture someone had been here within the last 24 hours. Maybe less. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the shadows, mind spinning. Someone else had been looking. Ranger was already at the doorway, growling low at the forest beyond. The silence outside suddenly felt unnatural. Too still. Even the birds were quiet. Jack walked over, unholstered his sidearm, and stepped out with Ranger at his side. The pine trees swayed gently in the wind. Nothing moved. But the footprint inside the bunker said otherwise. He circled the perimeter, checking the dirt, the tire tracks. The only fresh ones were his. Whoever had left that boot print had come on foot and had known exactly where to go. Back inside, Jack stared at the box again. The compass, the cipher, the photographs. His grandfather had hidden them behind concrete and metal, not to protect them from time, but from people. And now someone else knew about them. He locked the crate inside a military footlocker, slid it under the cot, and dragged the heaviest crate he could find over it. Ranger lay beside the wall, head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained wide open. "You found it first," Jack said quietly, kneeling beside him. "You always do." The dog didn't move, but Jack could feel the tension in his body, a coiled warning. Whatever they'd stepped into, it wasn't history. It was unfinished business, and someone out there wasn't done looking. Jack turned off the lantern. The bunker sank into darkness, but even in the black, he could still feel the whisper of eyes on them. Not ghosts, something worse, something real. The wind in the mountain pass was sharp, slicing down from the ridge like it carried memory in its chill. Jack drove south toward the edge of town, where the forests gave way to fading farmland and weathered picket fences. Ranger rode shotgun, eyes fixed on the road ahead like he understood they weren't just going for answers. They were digging into something people had chosen to forget. The address was handwritten on the back of the envelope Jack found in the metal box. Nora Bannister, once a military historian, now just a name living in the margins of his grandfather's old records. Jack didn't remember meeting her as a kid, but he remembered his grandfather mentioning her in reverent tones, always followed by the phrase, "She knows what others refuse to." Her house sat alone on a hill overlooking the main road, 2 stories of crumbling white paint and stubborn dignity. Wind chimes tinkled on the porch, and the smell of cedar and old paper seemed to seep through the windows. Jack knocked once. Ranger sat at his side, not barking, not moving, just watching the door. After a long pause, it opened. Nora Bannister was smaller than he expected, slender, sharp-eyed, wrapped in a wool shawl that looked handmade and worn from years of use. Her hair, silver and tied in a loose braid, fell across one shoulder like a reminder she hadn't bent to time's will entirely. "You're Samuel's grandson," she said without asking. Her voice was dry, steady, like someone used to commanding attention in lecture halls and war rooms alike. "Yes, Mum," Jack said. "Jack Delaney." "Jack." Her gaze shifted past him, landing on Ranger. Her eyes narrowed. "That's a military dog. He was mine. Iraq and Afghanistan. He's been with me longer than most humans have." She stepped aside without another word. Jack and Ranger entered the house, swallowed by the scent of old books, wood polish, and faint lavender. Inside, it was a living museum. Maps layered the walls, glass cabinets displayed rusted insignia, medals, faded dispatch papers. History wasn't a subject here, it was a tenant. Nora led them to a den lined with bookshelves and a single long table at the center, strewn with documents and half-finished tea. Ranger settled near the window, eyes on the outside, but ears turned inward, always listening. "What brought you here?" she asked. Jack placed the compass and cipher sheet on the table, followed by the photo of the vault door labeled Ashford's Last Stand. She didn't flinch. Her fingers moved slowly over the photo. Then the compass. Her mouth tightened. "You've been to the bunker?" Jack nodded. "My grandfather left it to me." "He left these too." She sat down, not like she was tired, but like she'd been waiting for this conversation a long time. "Do you know the name Colonel Charles Ashford?" she asked. "He's on the cipher." "And my grandfather mentioned him. A lot." She folded her hands, looking at Jack the way a professor might look at a student who stumbled into something far above his pay grade. Charles Ashford was a Union logistics officer during the final years of the Civil War. Quiet, brilliant, distrusted by the brass because he asked too many questions. In 1865, he disappeared along with a military payroll intended for 3 regiments. Gold. Tens of millions in today's money. Jack leaned forward. "You're saying he stole it?" Nora shook her head. That's what they wanted the world to think. But Ashford wasn't greedy. He was angry. Angry at the corruption he'd uncovered. Supplies redirected. Payments stolen. Soldiers dying without boots or bullets while their commanders profited. She paused, then reached for a binder on the side table and opened it to a page marked in red. "This is a letter Ashford wrote 2 weeks before he vanished. He talks about building a safeguard, a vault, not to protect the gold, but to protect the proof of what that gold meant. He called it a fortress for truth." Jack stared at the letter. Ashford's script matched the photo. The signature was unmistakable. "My grandfather believed him, didn't he?" Jack asked. Nora nodded. Samuel believed Ashford had succeeded. That he'd built the vault, hidden it, and encoded its location and keys across generations. "Your grandfather spent the last 20 years tracing the symbols, the cipher, the names of those who kept the secret alive. Why didn't he tell anyone?" He tried. But no one listened, and when they did, they tried to silence him. There were visitors. Men in suits, not government, not local, something else. Jack's stomach turned. He remembered the clean-cut stranger who approached him outside the bunker 2 days ago. Veil. The smile that didn't reach his eyes. The way Ranger had positioned himself like a shield. "He left something out there," Jack said. "Something he didn't want in the wrong hands." Nora gave a dry laugh. "Your grandfather was many things, but careless was never one of them." She leaned forward and tapped the cipher sheet. This isn't just a puzzle. It's a key, but only if you know what to look for. And only if you're fast." Jack frowned. "Fast?" Nora reached across the table and handed him another document, a photocopy of a property claim filed 6 weeks ago. His grandfather's bunker had been listed in a survey by a shell company. Jack scanned the page. The name at the bottom hit like a hammer. Vanguard Acquisitions, he read. That's the same name the man at the bunker used. Nora nodded. They've been looking too. And if you found this? I wasn't supposed to. Jack finished quietly. Across the room, Ranger let out a soft chuff and stood. His body tensed as he stepped toward the door. Jack didn't hear anything yet, but he trusted the dog more than his own instincts. They're watching? Jack said. Aren't they? I'd assume so. Nora replied. Your grandfather always said the past doesn't stay buried. Especially when it's wrapped in gold. Jack stood, scooping the compass and cipher back into his bag. I need to go. Nora followed him to the door. Jack, she said, voice lower now. If you're going to follow this, you'll need help, and you'll need that dog. He glanced at Ranger, already poised at the truck like he knew what came next. He's the reason I'm not dead already. Nora's eyes softened. Then don't let anyone separate you. Jack opened the truck door. Ranger hopped in without a word. As the engine turned over and the wheels hit the dirt, Jack looked once in the mirror. Nora Bannister stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the forest line. History wasn't behind him anymore. It was waiting ahead, buried under concrete and lies. And now it had a name, Ashford, and a map. And with Ranger beside him, Jack planned to follow it, all the way to the end. The wind had picked up by the time Jack returned to the bunker. Clouds hung low and heavy over the ridgeline, turning daylight into something dim and cautious. He parked the truck just outside the moss-covered entrance, Ranger already stiffening in the passenger seat. The dog's hackles rose before the engine even shut off. Jack looked at him. What is it? Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his body said enough. Ears forward, mouth closed, growl building low in his throat. Jack knew that sound. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, the kind you only develop after years in hostile places. Jack reached behind the seat, pulled out his sidearm, and slid it into his belt. The wind pushed through the pines, carrying something faint, a subtle change in air pressure, the scent of hot rubber, engine oil. Jack turned slowly toward the narrow trail that led to the main road. That's when he saw it. A black SUV crawling toward him, its paint too clean for the muddy ruts, its windows tinted so dark they swallowed reflection. It stopped 50 feet away and idled, quiet and intentional. Ranger was already out of the truck, standing between Jack and the vehicle, tail low, teeth barely bared. A warning. Not a threat. Not yet. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, composed and deliberate, dressed in what looked like backcountry gear, but it was too perfect. The jacket was Patagonia, clean as a showroom. The boots had never seen real dirt, and the man moved like someone who was used to having doors opened for him, not kicking them down. His hair was thick, silver along the edges, combed back with precision. His face was smooth, the kind of smooth you buy, not earn. And his smile was practiced. The kind Jack had seen too many times during casualty briefings and political handshakes. Mr. Delaney, the man said, voice like radio velvet. A pleasure. Jack said nothing. Ranger didn't budge. The man nodded toward the dog. He's well trained. He's better than most people, Jack replied. The man chuckled. I don't doubt it. May I? He took a step forward. Ranger's growl deepened instantly. His body dropped into a stance Jack recognized from deployment guarding, coiled for strike. I wouldn't, Jack said. The man stopped. Fair enough, he replied smoothly. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just a conversation. Jack waited. I represent a company called Vanguard Acquisitions. The man continued. We specialize in historic sites. Your property, this bunker, it's come up on a few of our radar screens. And I'll be honest, Jack, there aren't many properties left with this kind of character. We're prepared to make you an offer. He reached into his jacket, slowly, eyes on Jack, then pulled out a cream-colored envelope and extended it at arm's length. Jack didn't move. The man dropped it on the hood of Jack's truck. "I think you'll find it more than generous." "Your name?" Jack asked finally. "Vale. Nathan Vale. Not from around here, are you?" Vale smiled. "I go where the opportunities are." Jack glanced at the envelope, then back at the man. "I'm not interested." "You haven't even looked at the offer." "I don't need to." Vale's smile twitched, just slightly. A chip in the armor. "That's disappointing," he said. "This property has potential. But more importantly, it has risks, structural instability, old military wiring, hidden shafts." A man could get hurt. Jack stepped forward now, slowly, placing one hand on the truck bed beside the envelope. Ranger shifted with him, never breaking line of sight. "You came all the way out here to tell me my own land is dangerous." "I came to help you avoid an unfortunate accident," Vale said, tone still pleasant, but losing warmth fast. Jack leaned in, voice low. "Let me explain something, Vale. I've cleared compounds in Kandahar, slept under mortar fire, and walked 12 miles on a shattered ankle because a helicopter couldn't land in a dust storm. I've bled on ground that wasn't mine. This place, it is. You understand me?" Vale's smile was gone now. His eyes, however, glinted with something colder. "You think this is about you, Jack?" "It's not. You're just the man holding the deed." Vale pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it beside the envelope. "My number's on the back. My offer stands. For a little while. After that, you won't be the only one poking around in the dark." He turned and walked back to the SUV. No rush, no fear, just confidence that came from knowing someone bigger was backing him. The vehicle rolled away, tires humming softly over gravel until the forest swallowed the sound. Jack stood still, heart pounding, not with fear, but with the kind of awareness you only feel in combat. The moment before a fight breaks, the silence before the breach. Ranger came to his side, pressing lightly against his leg. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. Jack picked up the envelope and card, walked over to the fire pit he'd made the night before, and dropped both into the flames. They curled, blackened, and vanished. This wasn't about money. It was about whatever Vale already suspected was beneath the concrete and dirt. And it was clear now Jack wasn't the only one searching for Ashford's truth. He glanced down at Ranger, who sat beside him, gaze still fixed on the trees. "Good call, boy," Jack said. That guy reeked of trouble. Ranger didn't move. He was still listening, still watching. And so was Jack. The call went through on the third ring. "Jack Delaney," came the voice, gravel and tequila. "Man, it's been a long time." Jack leaned against the edge of the bunker, watching dusk crawl through the trees. Ranger sat nearby, one ear cocked toward the woods, the other tuned to the voice on speaker. "Luis, I need you in Montana." Now a pause. Then, "Tell me what's going on." "I've got an old World War II bunker on my hands, and I think it's more than just concrete and ghosts." Jack waited. He knew that tone of voice Luis used. It was the same one he'd had right before they disarmed a car bomb using dental floss and a bottle of water. Calculating. Curious. Dangerous. Finally, Ramirez spoke again. "I'll be there in 18 hours. Make sure the beer's cold and the dog's friendly." Jack smiled for the first time in days. He doesn't like many people. "Well, that makes 2 of us." Luis Ramirez arrived in a rental car that looked like it hadn't seen combat, but was already regretting the terrain. The tires crunched through pine needles and mud as he stepped out, wiry and sun-browned, a coil of kinetic energy wrapped in a faded Ranger hoodie. Ranger trotted over and sniffed him once. Luis stood still. Let him. Then Ranger did something Jack hadn't seen him do with anyone else in years. He licked Luis's hand. Jack raised an eyebrow. That's his version of a handshake. Luis knelt and scratched behind Ranger's ears. You've got a good one here. Got the eyes of a soldier. Seen too much, but still shows up. Ranger let out a low chuff, then padded back toward the bunker like the briefing was over. Inside, Jack spread out the cipher, the compass, the Ashford documents. Luis didn't ask questions. He read. He nodded. And when Jack pointed to the hollow sound in the west wall and the false floor plate beneath the cots, Luis crouched down and tapped the concrete like a surgeon searching for a pulse. Someone really didn't want this found, he said. You think it's rigged? You think it's Luis pulled a small case from his backpack and popped it open, revealing a set of tools more suited to a bomb squad than a historian. Only one way to find out. They spent the afternoon mapping the structure of the bunker, working off a hand-drawn schematic Jack's grandfather had scribbled into one of the journals. It wasn't exact, but it gave enough clues. The west wall had a cavity behind it, and possibly a lower level accessible through a hidden shaft. Luis pried up a floor grate using a flat crowbar and flashlight, revealing a narrow metal ladder descending into pitch black. Nice of them not to put up a sign, he muttered. Jack looked at Ranger. The dog was already staring into the hole, nose twitching, body alert. He's going down first, Jack said. Luis blinked. You serious? He'll smell danger before we ever hear it. Ranger slipped through the opening without hesitation, paws landing softly on each rung before dropping into the dark. Jack followed next, then Luis. The air below was colder, older, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Their boots echoed down the corridor as they moved forward. Flashlights danced across stone walls and rusted pipes. The place looked like a buried submarine, tight, silent, breathing only when they did. They rounded a corner and found a series of small alcove storage rooms, by the look of them, but all sealed tight with mechanical locks long since corroded. Then Ranger stopped. Jack froze behind him. The dog's ears shot forward, his front paw lifted, hovering. A silent cue Jack had seen him use on IED patrol. It meant one thing. Trap. Luis was already scanning the floor. Pressure plate. Old school. Looks like it controls something in the wall. Maybe gas. Maybe a projectile. Ranger backed up carefully, guiding Jack with him. They marked the trap with chalk and moved on. Ranger saved them again 2 turns later, this time from a tripwire strung low and nearly invisible. Whoever built this lower level hadn't just buried secrets, they'd buried them with teeth. You see this? Luis said, pointing to a control panel set into the stone. This isn't defensive. It's strategic. They weren't just hiding something, they were expecting someone to come looking. Jack stared at the etched symbols on the panel. They matched those on the cipher page from Ashford. I think they knew exactly who that would be. Later, they found a rusted door with a circular handle and faded stenciling in block letters. S3 vault access. Clearance required. Luis knelt to examine the mechanism. It's not locked, he said. It's waiting. Jack raised the compass. Its needle spun slightly, then clicked to a stop, aligning with a groove in the wall beside the door. Ranger growled low, not at the door, but back the way they came. Jack turned sharply. Silence. Then the faintest sound. A whisper of gravel shifting. A breath caught in someone else's throat. They weren't alone. Luis stepped towards the shadows, side arm drawn. Stay close, he said. Jack crouched beside Ranger, hand resting on his fur. The dog was rigid, ready, not afraid. I think Vale came back, Jack said. Then we make sure he doesn't leave with anything, Luis replied. They didn't find the source of the noise. Not that night. But something had changed. The feeling in the air. The silence had shifted. It wasn't just a bunker anymore, it was a contested zone. Back at the surface, Jack locked the entrance tight. Luis wired a proximity alarm on the door, and Ranger curled beside the cot like a soldier on watch. Jack sat beside him, the flicker of lantern light dancing over the map spread on the table. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly. Ranger blinked once, slow, deliberate. Jack didn't need words. He already knew. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The door opened with a sound like the mountain itself exhaled. Rusted hinges shrieked in protest as Jack and Luis pried it loose, layer by layer, exposing a narrow passage choked with decades of dust and silence. Ranger stood at the threshold, tail stiff, ears forward, body carved with tension. He didn't move until Jack nodded, and then he slipped into the dark like a ghost with a mission. Inside, the air was cold and dry, like it had been sealed in time. The walls bore marking symbols that matched those on the cipher sheet. Arrows, names, coded phrases in the same block script they'd found in Ashford's notes. Jack ran his gloved fingers across the stone, following a carved line until it stopped at a panel. The compass needle jerked sharply and locked. Luis knelt beside it, ran a small device across the edge, and let out a low whistle. "There's a magnetic relay behind this. Old school, this whole damn place is a vault, but the lock isn't gold, it's math." Jack pulled a second sheet from his pack, one of the pages from the metal box he'd recovered. It held coordinates, encoded in overlapping grid patterns. Ashford hadn't just built a bunker, he'd designed a logic maze, one meant to deter the greedy, but reward the patient. Luis grinned as he decoded it piece by piece. "This is genius." He created a system based on directional pressure. Like playing chess blindfolded with landmines, they followed the sequence through a winding corridor, making turns only when the compass and cipher aligned. At one juncture, the floor dipped into a narrow trench lined with iron grates. Ranger froze again. He sniffed the grate, then growled low and pulled back. Luis dropped to a crouch and peeled back a piece of rusted metal. Beneath it, coiled wires and 2 glass vials filled with yellowing liquid. "Nerve gas. Homemade. Pressure triggered," Luis muttered. Ashford wasn't bluffing. Jack looked at Ranger, who stood like a statue, eyes locked on the path ahead. "You just saved us again," Jack whispered. They moved slower now. An hour in, the corridor opened into a chamber the size of a 2-car garage. The walls were lined with reinforced steel panels, the floor layered in overlapping footprints from boots long rotted away. At the center, a pedestal. On it sat a sealed wooden crate, aged but intact. The brass hinges gleamed under Luis's flashlight. Ranger approached it first, sniffed carefully, then sat down with a heavy breath. Jack stepped forward and opened the lid. Inside, parchment, leather-bound journals, and one folded letter atop the pile. The paper had yellowed, but the ink remained bold. The signature at the bottom read, "Colonel Charles Ashford." Jack opened the letter with hands he tried to keep steady. "To whom this is found, what lies beneath your hands is not meant for power or profit. It is a record of betrayal of officers who sold rations for silver, who let men die in the mud so their names could rise through ranks bought in silence. I could not allow it to vanish. The gold they stole was never meant to be mine, nor theirs. It is here as bait for those who chase gold without conscience. The truth, however, is the real prize, and it lies buried in testimony, logs, letters, all here. I built this vault not as a monument but a warning. Do not let them bury it again." See Ashford Jack let the paper fall to his lap. He understood now. The gold was a decoy, a lure. But what Ashford truly wanted to protect was the story, the rot behind the medals. And Jack's grandfather somehow had known, had helped protect it. Probably kept the search alive, even as time turned truth into myth. Luis thumbed through one of the journals. Pages of supply line disruptions, intercepted messages, photos, names. Some of the surnames Jack recognized. On banks, on corporate boards. On the business card Vale had left smouldering in the fire pit. Jack stood, breath sharp in his chest. "My grandfather was a gatekeeper," he said quietly. Luis looked up. "Then we're not the first ones down here." That was when they heard it. A faint, high-pitched buzz, like a mosquito, but mechanical. Jack turned toward the narrow stairwell behind them. A flicker of movement zipped through the air. Ranger lunged upward and snapped his jaw. His teeth clamped around something with a sharp crack. When he dropped it, Jack knelt to examine the crushed body. A drone, palm-sized, lens still blinking. Luis muttered a curse. "They found us." Jack stood fast. "Vale." He grabbed the crate and sealed it tight. "They've been watching." Waiting for us to unlock it for them, Luis tossed his gear into his pack. "That drone's probably live-streamed everything. They know we're inside." Jack turned to Ranger, who stood at full alert, body aimed towards the surface. "Let's move," Jack said. "Seal the vault behind us." As they made their way back up the winding corridor, Jack knew things had shifted. The story wasn't just hidden anymore. Now it had been seen. And Vale would be coming. Not with a briefcase this time, but with force. Night pressed hard against the trees as Jack and Luis returned to the surface. The wind had shifted sharp and electric, like before a storm or a firefight. Ranger stood at the edge of the tree line, tail low, nose high, eyes fixed on the darkness that pooled between the pines. Luis zipped up his pack, fingers moving faster than usual. "You feel that?" he said quietly. Jack nodded. "They're coming." Ranger let out a short, guttural bark, not loud but precise. Then a second, pitched higher. A 3-beat sequence. It was a sound Jack hadn't heard in years, not since their third deployment together. A combat warning. Not for civilians, not for hunting deer or strangers at the door. This one was military. Ranger had been trained for special ops, just like Jack, just like Luis. 2 men. "Fast, flanking wide," Jack whispered. Luis checked his sidearm. "You sure?" "I'm not," Jack replied. "He is." They didn't run. Instead, they moved. Ranger leading, Jack and Luis flanking him, heading back towards the hatch entrance to the lower vault chamber. They slipped inside and sealed it from below, then dropped into the tunnel system Ashford had designed like a madman's labyrinth. Luis was already pulling out the journal. "There are 6 trap systems we haven't touched. Pressure doors, collapsing ceilings, one that floods the corridor if tripped." "We can't use the water," Jack said. "It'll drown the evidence." "Right. Let's go old school. Fire, steel, and noise." Ranger barked again, short and sharp this time, then dashed ahead. Jack saw the blur of his tail disappear down a side corridor. "Where's he going?" "To defend," Jack said. "You heard the sound he gave." "He's intercepting," Luis cursed. "We'll lose him." "No," Jack said. "He knows this place better than we do." Vale and his men entered quiet. Too quiet. They didn't bother yelling names or threats. They had night vision, ARS, body armor. Jack and Luis watched them through a rusted ventilation grate, their shapes ghosting between beams of broken light. One of them carried a small device in his hand, scanning for heat signatures. "Modern toys," Luis muttered. "Let's give them something antique." Jack led them to the western alcove, where they'd mapped the pressure plates but hadn't armed them yet. Luis set the mechanism with a screwdriver, and old wire twisted into copper shunts. "1 man steps here," he said, "and the wall throws shrapnel from a compressed air tank." Low-tech, but loud. They backed off, waited. One of Vale's men entered the alcove, sweeping side to side with his rifle. His boot landed squarely on the plate. The sound was deafening. A hiss, then a boom. Metal splinters sprayed into the corridor. Screams followed, short and sharp. But the other two advanced. Then, Ranger's warning bark came again, closer this time. Jack turned and ran. He found the dog first. Ranger stood in the middle of the northern corridor, squared off against a man twice his size. The man raised his rifle. In that frozen second, Jack saw the trigger tighten. Ranger lunged. It wasn't a leap. It was a missile, a blur of muscle and precision. He collided with the gunman's chest, sending him slamming back into the wall. The rifle clattered to the ground. But the man's backup was already there. A second shot rang out. Ranger yelped, a sound Jack had only heard once before, on a battlefield halfway across the world. He fired instinctively, 2 rounds into the shoulder of the second man. The attacker dropped. Jack knelt beside Ranger. Blood soaked the dog's left flank. But his eyes were locked on the control lever at the end of the hallway, the one Ashford had labeled Gate Split. Luis appeared behind him. "He can't reach it." Ranger tried. He crawled forward, dragging himself with his front paws, blood smearing behind him. "Don't," Jack said, moving to lift him. But Ranger snarled not at Jack, but at time, at pain, at the unfinished job. Then, with a final push, he reached the lever and slammed it down with his paw. Somewhere inside the bunker, gears groaned. Steel gates dropped from the ceiling, slamming between corridors, cutting Vale's remaining men off from the vault chamber. They were trapped, isolated, just as Ashford had designed it. Jack cradled Ranger gently, whispering to him, voice breaking. Luis stood watch with his rifle as Vale's voice echoed faintly from beyond the sealed gate. "This isn't over, Delaney." Jack didn't answer. He carried Ranger back toward the main chamber, Luis covering their 6. The vault was safe. For now, the evidence still intact, the mission still breathing. But Ranger Jack wasn't sure. He lay the dog down on a wool blanket and pressed gauze against the wound. "You held the line," Jack said, voice low. "You didn't let them in." Ranger's eyes blinked once, slow and steady. Still on duty, still guarding the truth. The gate groaned as Jack turned the brass key. The mechanism inside the wall clicked and churned with the slow certainty of old machines still doing their job. Dust cascaded from the arch above as steel gears rotated, pulling back a thick, reinforced door that had not been opened in decades. What lay behind it was not just history, it was revelation. Rows of steel vaults lined the chamber walls, each marked with dates, initials, and military insignia long erased from the public record. The floor was tiled in slate, covered in the faint prints of men who had built and hidden this place with intention. In the center of the room stood a reinforced desk, its top stacked with crates labeled in Ashford's precise hand. Payroll 3rd Division, muster rolls, medical records, redacted. And tucked between those crates of gold bars, each stamped with a Union Eagle and the year 1864. Luis let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding, Ashford." Jack didn't respond. He was already crossing to the far wall, where sealed lockers bore the names of towns, bases, and units. He opened one. Inside were testimony pages, signed affidavits, ledgers. One word appeared again and again. Burden. It was the code name Ashford had used. But it was also something else now, something Jack had carried for years without knowing it had a source. Ranger limped into the chamber, one leg bandaged, eyes alert. Jack knelt and rested his hand gently against the dog's neck. "You made it, buddy. You really made it." They weren't alone for long. From somewhere above, boots slammed against metal. A muffled explosion shook dust from the rafters. Vale was coming fast and reckless now. He'd seen the drone feed, seen the trap triggered, and realized time was no longer on his side. Luis sealed the inner gate. That'll hold for a minute. Maybe 2. Then we use it, Jack said, pulling out a small transmitter. He flipped the switch and waited. A red light blinked twice. Signal sent. Vale's voice echoed from behind the vault door. Jack! Don't be stupid. You know how this ends. Ranger growled low. Jack raised his voice. Yeah, that's why I'm finishing it. The door frame shook as Vale's men began working it with cutting torches. Heat shimmered in the edges. Luis moved quickly, dragging crates into a defensive arc. He looked at Jack. FBI's going to get that signal. They're already in the air, Jack said. That transmitter's tied to an old NORAD relay my grandfather buried in the West Ridge. We're not the only ones who know this bunker exists anymore. The vault door blasted inward. Vale stepped through. Dust clung to his suit like guilt. His face was no longer smiling. It was stone. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the gold, then the documents, then the dog. So, he said, stepping forward. You figured it out. Jack didn't answer. Vale continued. This place was never about the gold. Ashford knew that. So did your grandfather. But you thought you were just here to finish a story. Luis raised his weapon. One more step. Vale ignored him. You think exposing this will change anything? These records mean nothing. They're paper. This country was built on forgetting what's inconvenient. Jack stepped between Vale and the table of documents. Some things don't stay forgotten. Vale's jaw tightened. That's where you're wrong. He pulled a pistol from beneath his coat. Ranger growled. Luis clicked off the safety. But then, from above, voices. Commands. Federal agents, drop your weapons. The sound of boots, hard and fast, flooded the stairwell. FBI tactical teams stormed the corridor behind Vale. He turned, startled, but it was too late. A wall of agents in black surrounded him. One stepped forward, badge in hand. Mr. Vale, you're under arrest for obstruction of federal investigation, conspiracy, and unauthorized access to protected historical infrastructure. Vale turned back to Jack, expression flickering for the first time. Not fear. Recognition. You knew, he whispered. You used the dog as a decoy. Jack shook his head. No, I used the dog to survive you. Vale was cuffed, read his rights, and led out. But the truth didn't walk out with him. It stayed behind on shelves, in ledgers, in pages that named names and told stories of men who bought power with silence. As the room cleared, one of the agents approached Jack quietly. Your grandfather worked with us decades ago. He buried this place because he knew the system wasn't ready to handle it. Is it now? Jack asked. The agent paused. We'll find out. Later, as the sun broke over the ridge, Jack sat on the tailgate of his truck. Ranger beside him, bandage freshly changed, eyes still sharp. Luis leaned against a pine tree, sipping burnt coffee. You know, he said, Vale was on the board of Medinexus. Jack looked up. Luis continued. The insurance group. They handled your wife's claims. Jack's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A tightening. A long, slow burn. All those denials, Luis said. It wasn't bureaucracy. It was leverage. Pressure Jack didn't answer. He reached down and scratched Ranger's ears, voice low and steady. They tried to bury the truth with money, with policy, with lies. Ranger's tail thumped once. They didn't count on the dog, Jack said, or the war he still remembered. And somewhere in the stillness of the Montana forest, the last of the vault's secrets began to rise. The clinic sat at the edge of the valley, a converted ranger station with patched walls and a veterinary team trained to handle working dogs, military search and rescue, police. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and pine. Outside, the forest waited, hushed like it too, held its breath. Ranger lay on a padded table, IV running, flank stitched where the bullet had torn through muscle. His breathing was steady but shallow, the bandages wrapped tight against his ribs, chest rising in slow rhythm. His eyes, half-lidded, followed Jack as he paced the room. Jack stopped beside him. He ran a hand gently over Ranger's head, letting it rest behind the dog's ears the way he had 1,000 times before every mission, every drop, every patrol. "You took that hit without flinching," Jack whispered. "We wouldn't be here without you, buddy." Not even close, Ranger let out a quiet exhale, eyes softening. It wasn't a whimper. It was something more like understanding. Louise stood silently near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene with the same respect they'd give a fallen soldier. Because that's what this was. A soldier still fighting, still holding the line. The vet entered, nodded once to Jack, then checked Ranger's vitals. "He's stable," she said. "Tough dog." Seen a few like him, not many. Jack didn't move his hand. "You haven't seen any like him." The vet gave a quiet smile, then stepped out. Louise followed her, giving Jack space. Alone with Ranger, Jack sat beside the table and pulled something from his pocket, a ribbon from Claire's old field journal. He tucked it into the folds of Ranger's bandage, a piece of the past anchoring the present. "Claire would have loved you," Jack said. "You two had the same instincts. Knew when to bite and when to sit and just watch the world burn." Ranger blinked once, then closed his eyes. By the end of the week, the FBI had completed their first assessment. Dozens of crates of documents had been airlifted out under tight security. The gold remained, now under federal protection. But Jack had made it clear, from the beginning, that he didn't want it. He stood before the lead agent at the field office, hands in his pockets, the faint scent of diesel and copier paper filling the hallway. "You sure about this?" the agent asked. "You're legally entitled to a portion." "I don't want a medal. Or a payout," Jack said. "I want something that'll last longer than memory." He pulled a single slip of paper from his wallet and slid it across the table. "The Claire Delaney Fund. A foundation for veterans' families." Jack explained. "Specifically for those drowning in medical debt. I know what that feels like." "So did she." The agent nodded slowly. "You're not keeping any for yourself?" Jack looked out the window. "I've already got what matters." A month later, the bunker was reclassified, not as a federal asset, not as a crime scene, but as a historical landmark. Work crews stabilized the entrances, replaced the broken steel with tempered glass and reinforced panels. Signage was posted, cameras installed. But much of Ashford's work, the symbols, the inscriptions, even the trap corridors were preserved exactly as they were, a warning and a tribute. School buses began to arrive by fall. College students came to study wartime logistics. Veterans walked the hallways in silence, some with canes, some with scars you couldn't see. They all paused at the central vault, at the wall where Ashford's final letter now hung, framed behind shatterproof glass. Jack stood at the entrance that morning, dressed in jeans, boots, and a clean Ranger jacket. His face bore lines, now new ones, but his eyes had steadied. Louise stood beside him, nodding to a group of high schoolers walking in wide-eyed, listening to the tour guide explain the significance of Vault S3. And just off the path, laying in the grass beneath a patch of filtered sunlight, was Ranger. His bandage was gone now, the fur still growing back. He no longer limped, but his posture remained alert, noble, like a sentry who would never leave his post. Kids would sometimes drift over, ask to pet him. Jack always let them, with a simple nod. "That dog?" the guide would say. "He helped save everything inside." Sometimes the kids laughed, sometimes they nodded, serious. But Jack knew the truth. It wasn't about what Ranger did in one fight. It was what he represented. Loyalty, silence, courage without spectacle. Late that evening, after the crowd had left and the trail lights buzzed on, Jack walked the corridor alone. Ranger padded behind him, quiet as the wind. He paused at Ashford's plaque. Read it again. I built this vault not as a monument, but a warning. Do not let them bury the truth again. Jack looked down at Ranger, who stood tall despite the miles, despite the pain. Looks like you did it. Jack said softly. You guarded it to the end. Ranger leaned his head gently against Jack's thigh, still on watch, always. And Jack, for the first time in years, finally felt the weight lift not from his shoulders, but from his chest. Grief had hollowed him out, but this was the start of something solid, something his wife would have believed in, something Ranger had carved into the earth with tooth and claw and will, legacy, one that barked when it mattered, and never backed down. 6 months passed. The snow had melted off the northern ridge, feeding the pine forests and carving new paths through the rocks behind the Ashford bunker. Spring returned with a cautious kind of warmth, as if even the seasons had learned to tread lightly around the place. The bunker, now officially registered as the Ashford Delaney Historic Site, had become more than a curiosity. School buses lined the gravel lot each Saturday. Veterans came in ones and twos, sometimes with family, sometimes alone. College students made notes in hushed tones, some chasing degrees in history, others in law or ethics. Jack stood at the entrance each morning, wearing a simple name badge that read, Volunteer Guide, Jack D. He didn't care for titles. He cared that people remembered. He cared that they looked at the documents inside, not the gold, and walked away understanding how close the country once came to forgetting what mattered. He'd begin each tour the same way. This isn't just a vault, it's a confession. One built with stone and silence, and one guarded by a soldier most people wouldn't notice at first. At his feet, as always, was Ranger. He moved slower now. His joints ached in the cold. The old gunshot wound sometimes flared up, but he still rose with Jack every morning, walked the corridor once before the doors opened, then lay down just to the right of the main vault door, his spot. The kids loved him. Veterans respected him. Scholars noted him. But Ranger didn't care. He never barked at cameras or chased attention. He just watched, listened, stayed ready. And that's what made the quote above the main entrance so honest, carved into a steel plaque, mounted flush with the wall. He didn't bark for glory. He barked to protect the truth Luis visited every few weeks, always with something loud and fried from a gas station and a grim joke about how Ranger was the most famous employee on federal property. He should run for mayor, Luis said once. He's already more qualified than half the council. Jack smiled, scratched Ranger behind the ear, and said, He doesn't want power. Just peace one Friday. A group of middle school kids stood wide-eyed at the vault. Jack finished the story of Ashford's betrayal and the decades of silence that followed. A boy in the back raised his hand. Is the dog the same one who saved everything? Jack nodded. That's him. How do you know what to do? The boy asked. Jack crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand on the old shepherd's back. Because he wasn't just trained. He chose to act. That's the difference between instinct and loyalty. Instinct fades. Loyalty never does. The kids fell quiet. One girl whispered to her friend, That dog's a hero. Jack didn't correct her. Later that night, after the last visitors left, and the wind rustled through the pines again, Jack and Ranger sat just outside the main entrance. The stars were sharp. The valley below shimmered with the scattered lights of a town that still didn't fully understand what had nearly remained buried forever. Jack leaned back against the wall, his voice barely above the breeze. They'll keep coming. They'll tell the story now. Because of you. Ranger shifted, resting his graying muzzle on Jack's boot. You didn't bark for applause. You barked for the truth. Jack looked at the plaque once more, then out into the dark, his chest heavy with gratitude. And if you stood in that spot right where Ranger lay, you could almost feel it. The memory, the presence. A quiet that wasn't empty, but full of all the things that never made the headlines but built something stronger than legacy. Loyalty, sacrifice, the courage to act when no one's watching. So now we ask you, what's your story with a loyal pet? If Ranger's journey moved you, if you believe in stories that honor the silent heroes, especially the ones on 4 legs, consider subscribing to the German Shepherd channel. Help us keep these stories alive, not for glory, but because they matter.